The fuel came out, the sandbags came off, and here's what we learned from F1's first qualifying session of the year at the Australian Grand Prix. Throughout pre-season testing and free practice in Australia, everybody in F1 was convinced Mercedes had the advantage. The question was by how much, and how exactly that would manifest in qualifying. The answer was by just under 0.8 of a second, given that was George Russell's margin over the fastest non-Mercedes, Isaac Hadjar's Red Bull. And the long runs on Friday suggest it will be the same story in the race, to the point where Hadjar stated that Red Bull simply doesn't have the pace to win. So where does that advantage lie? In short, everywhere. The Mercedes power unit is the market leader, but the team also has a good grasp on how to optimise harvesting and deployment, as well as a genuinely good chassis. A significant proportion of its advantage over Red Bull and Ferrari came on the straights, but it's still pretty handy in the corners as well. Albert Park may not be the most representative track on the calendar, but Russell and Mercedes have emphatically underlined their status as championship favourites. If the Mercedes engine is so strong, then why are its customer teams not up there at the front with the works team, especially reigning world champion McLaren? It's a good question, especially given McLaren was almost 9/10 off Mercedes, the Alpine was 2 seconds down, and Williams almost 2.5 seconds off. Some of that will be down to differences in chassis performance, particularly when it comes to the Alpine and Williams deficits. But even though the regulations mean all the Mercedes-powered teams have identical specification engines with the same modes available, the works team is far ahead in optimising the crucial energy regime. As McLaren team principal Andrea Stella says, it's all about exploiting that potential. Although Mercedes is quicker than McLaren in some corners, the majority of its advantage is on the straights. That reflects the knowledge deficit, which is understood to be related to subtle differences in the harvesting and deployment strategy. The good news is that it shouldn't take too long to work out what Mercedes is doing better. Stella reckons McLaren could have locked out the second row with the lessons it learned during qualifying. F1 had been able to keep most drivers on message about the new 2026 rules up until Melbourne because there was an element of everyone being willing to wait to see what the cars were like in competition. But as the scale of Mercedes' advantage has become crystal clear and qualifying was compromised by everyone having to slow down at the end of straights to save energy, drivers broke rank and laid bare just how downcast they are about what they'll be racing this year. Things had already got heated in the drivers' briefing on Friday night as Max Verstappen led a chorus of disapproval about what drivers had experienced on track. He then admitted after qualifying that he was having no fun with the new cars, with his mood worsened by an apparent technical problem sending him off into the barrier when kicking off a flying lap at the start of Q1, which has left him 20th on the grid for Sunday's race. But even some of those who had better days and had defended things before are now in a different camp. World champion Lando Norris was perhaps the most disappointed, saying that it sucks that F1's gone from the best cars ever in the previous rules era to perhaps its worst. F1's paddock erupted into political theatre on Saturday morning when teams and drivers came together to resist a safety change made by the FIA that would have made the engine management situation even worse. Following some comments made by a few drivers in Friday night's briefing that the new 2026 cars were a bit sketchy on the high-speed run from turn 6 to turn 9 when straight mode was engaged, the FIA moved swiftly to respond. Fearful about the potential risks of a crash while following closely in low downforce trim, the FIA sent a note to teams just over 2 hours before final practice to say it was scrapping the straight mode activation zone in that area on safety grounds. It did that after checking a lot of data, but not consulting with the teams beforehand. And it triggered a revolt from competitors who would have needed to start setup work from scratch. With no zone there, it would force changes to cambers, tyre pressures, ride heights, and energy deployment tactics. It would also make the cars even slower on the straights because the wings would be in high drag mode and need to save more energy because of the lack of efficiency. One team simulation reckoned that they would be approaching turn 9 50 km an hour slower than F3 cars. A unified push from the majority of drivers and teams prompted an FIA U-turn. But the whole affair has just furthered the narrative that the new rules are too complex and compromising and something needs to be done quite quickly. We're going to be following this very closely, so if you want the inside line on the 2026 rules and what could change in season, check out the Race Members Club. We'll be bringing you exclusive content and behind the scenes insight as your F1 Paddock Pass for 2026, and right now you can get 90% off your first month's subscription. Just check out the link in the description. Even though this turned into a qualifying to forget for Verstappen, Red Bull still goes into Sunday's race with a real chance of a podium. For the first time in what feels like forever, it's been able to rely on its second car to step up in Verstappen's absence. Hadjar will line up for his Red Bull Racing debut in third place on the grid, having picked up the pieces brilliantly in Melbourne. He was a solid top 5 threat in final practice and the first 2 segments of qualifying, then took a further step when it really counted in Q3. Hadjar pipped Ferrari's Charles Leclerc and McLaren's Oscar Piastri by less than a tenth of a second, getting Red Bull ahead of its two immediate rivals in the process. Hadjar said he was only in the top 3 because of Verstappen's problem, but that's the point. When Verstappen's not there, Red Bull needs his teammate to be, and Hadjar's shown at the very first attempt that he is capable of doing exactly that. Ferrari's early promise once again turned into a pretty unremarkable qualifying result. Strong form in pre-season testing and on Friday in Australia when Charles Leclerc led a Ferrari 1-2 in practice never really signposted Ferrari was the benchmark for the start of 2026, but it seemed it could genuinely be best of the rest. So qualifying 4th and 7th with an even bigger gap to Mercedes than Leclerc's pessimistic prediction of half a second was a blow. There wasn't a huge amount between Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton, who was just under 2/10 slower than his teammate, and both drivers complained about vague issues with energy deployment after qualifying. Maybe Ferrari execution was behind some of the 8/10 deficit then, but it's clearly performance that it simply can't match. In fact, Mercedes' energy deployment is so good that Leclerc thought that car's data had loaded incorrectly when he went to check it after final practice. After all Aston Martin's travails in the build-up to the Australia weekend and how it started on Friday, Fernando Alonso was actually surprisingly close to getting into Q2. Alonso hacked his deficit to the front to 2.7 seconds by the end of the first part of qualifying and will start 17th out of the 22 cars on Sunday. Given where Aston Martin was in testing, that's actually quite reasonable. But it was flattered by problems eliminating 2 cars that would have been ahead of Alonso on merit, and the fact Cadillac ended up being slightly detached at the back of the grid. Honda is seeing signs that the severe vibrations that wrecked its testing program are more under control, which is encouraging. Still, reliability remains a big uncertainty going into Sunday, and we're still not completely sure that both Aston Martins will take the start. Lance Stroll is allowed to, despite not setting a time within the mandated 107% limit in any session so far this weekend, as he failed to complete a single lap on Saturday due to a damaged oil line that took too long to fix. But the stewards gave him permission to race based on Alonso's speed and Stroll's experience, so now we just need to see if his car can actually run. Melbourne might be tightening the field because it's a relatively short lap with few real corners, but the midfield's closer to the leading teams here than testing suggested and more condensed itself. Fears that the grid will be split into 2 groups with the second between them have proven unfounded, for Australia at least, with only half that margin separating the top 4 teams and the midfield. Racing Bulls is at the head of the group and impressively got both its cars into Q3. Arvid Lindblad excelled until what the team called a control issue, which we're taking to mean engine mapping relating to battery deployment, cost him significant performance on his final run. That left him 9th on the grid behind teammate Liam Lawson, but still well placed to fight for points on his F1 debut. Audi, Haas and Alpine are all within half a second or so of Racing Bulls, with overweight Williams the same margin further back again, so it's not as close as last year with that group, but it's still competitive. And Aston Martin's jump forward, in relative terms, meant there was only 1.5 seconds between the 5th and 10th best teams in Q1. That's bad news for Cadillac, which got cut adrift by another 7/10 on its qualifying debut and will be relying on other factors to bring it into the mix on Sunday.